So now that we know exactly what each of our wrapper elements is doing, let's continue with some more styling. First, we're going to settle up the timer and button wrappers. If we look at our mock, we can see that the two of them together fill up the entire header, which is not happening right now, and that the timer area is a little bit larger than the actual button wrapper itself. So because we want these to be different heights, but we want them to fill up the entire header area, we're still going to use the flex property, but we're going to use it with a value other than 1. So let's give it a shot. Down in our style sheet, down at the bottom of the page, we're going to add a timer wrapper and a button wrapper. Now, one way of achieving this sort of layout, of having one element this tall and the other that tall, is to very directly set a height of whatever value on here. And I guarantee you, when you start doing some layouts, you're going to want to start. Your natural instinct is going to be, well, I estimate this area right here to be about 400 pixels or whatever. I'll make this one 300 and this guy 100. And I got to tell you, do not fall into this trap right here. As much as possible, we always want to be using Flexbox to accomplish our layout. And the reason for that is that when we're building mobile apps, our screen size is going to change dramatically, right? Right now we're using a iPhone 6 simulator. We can just as easily be using a iPhone 6 Plus or a iPhone 5S or a iPhone 3G with a significantly smaller size. So when we're building mobile apps, we generally have kind of a fixed size unless we are distinctly trying to scroll elements through here. And when you have that fixed size, you can't rely on fixed heights and widths to position your elements. So just keep that in mind. Once we're styling individual elements, like say the individual button, start, and lap, we can start using fixed heights and widths. But to roughly position things on the screen, we don't want to be using fixed heights and widths. Okay, so again, the issue that we're going to have here is that we don't want to use a fixed height and a fixed width for our timer wrapper and our button wrapper. We want them to fill up the entire header, but we also don't want them to be equal. So that kind of rules out using Flex 1 on the header and the footer as we did previously. We still are going to use Flex, but we're going to use it slightly differently. So I'm going to say Flex 5 on here and Flex 3 over here. I'm also going to add in a comment just so it's clear. This is the red area. Oops. And this is our green. Let's bear with me here for a second with these values. Let's go ahead and make use of the two styles up at the top. So we'll wrap the border in an array, and we'll say styles.timerWrapper, and we're going to wrap this one in an array, and we'll say styles.buttonWrapper. Cool. So we're going to save this, and then we'll refresh, and sure enough, everything worked out. We're filling up the entire header. The red one is slightly larger than the green one. So how did this achieve that? Well, it's the magic of Flexbox. Well, just kidding. There's a little bit more of a science to it than that. When we allot Flex 5 and Flex 3, both the timer wrapper and button wrapper are siblings, right? They are at the same level. What we do is, as a trick in here, is we add up these two flex numbers, which adds up to 8, and that's the total units of space that's available. You can now imagine that this entire header up here was divided into 8 separate units. Flex 5 means that the timer wrapper gets 5 of those available units, whereas Flex 3 means button wrapper gets 3 of those available units. So let's add a comment in here, and we'll say takes up 5/8 of the available space, whereas the button wrapper takes up 3/8 of the available space. We got the 8 here by adding 5 plus 3. If we started to do something like Flex 5, This now adds up to 10, and we get 5. Flex 5 is 5, flex 5 is 5, and then total 5 plus 5 is 10. So now with flex 5 on both, that means that they're each, again, taking up half the space. And so you see they're both now half the space. If we were using our, obviously if we were using our fractions, if we have 5 and 5 on both, then really we should just reduce them both down to 1. By using 3/8 and 5/8, we just get a slight, I undid too far, there we go. By using 3 and 5, we just get a slightly different distribution of area, like so. All right. So with that out of the way, we now need to get started with the start and lap buttons on the same line. So right now, as you can see, they stack on top of each other. So we need to somehow get them side by side. The way that we're going to do that is by making use of that property that we discussed very briefly previously, which is the flex direction property. So the 2 buttons, start and lap, are contained inside of the button wrapper. So what we want to do is, instead of having the button wrapper stack all of its content going downwards, which means flex direction column, we want it to go sideways, which is flex direction row. So we'll add an additional rule to the button wrapper, flex direction row. Let's refresh, and there we go, side by side now. The next thing we want to do, looking at our mock over here, is make sure that there's some space on the left, some space on the right over here, and some space in between as well. Now, this is very possibly another instance where you could be very tempted to use some fixed margin. Maybe we would have the start button with a margin left of 200 and then 200 in between, blah, 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 so on. Again, you got to resist that temptation. We never want to use fixed pixels for our positioning of elements on here. Instead, we're going to continue to use Flexbox. So let's look at our cheat sheet again. If you've lost the URL, you can grab it here at the top, or just search for CSS, a guide to Flexbox, and you should find it pretty easily. So we're going to use justify content to get some spacing between our buttons. And specifically, we're going to use space around. What space around does is it says, for all the available space I have, divide it equally and allot it to the spaces between each of my items. It ends up kind of looking like so. That rule is going to be placed onto the button wrapper because we want all that available space to be applied equally between the button wrapper's children, which are the start and lap buttons. So here's our button wrapper, and we'll add justify content space around. Refresh, and hot dog, this is looking pretty good. Side by side, and we've got space on the left, between, and on the right. Now, the one other thing we want to have here is to make sure that the buttons themselves are vertically aligned. Normally, we would use justify content of center to do that, but remember, we've already flipped our flex direction using flex direction row, which means we're now going to use align items center to center them inside of this container. All right, one last little step in here. Let's position our timer in the right spot. So in this case, we don't need to do any fancy justify content or align items. We'll just do regular old center of justify content and center of align items. And it looks like I missed a semicolon, or excuse me, a comma after flex 5. All right, so this is looking pretty good. So our timer is now centered, and we've got space between our 2 buttons. So let's continue in the next section.